We were just following the map until the forest swallowed us whole. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth as we set off, 4 campers with no guide but an old, wrinkled map. There was something intoxicating about the forest, its endless trails, and the way the sunlight scattered through the canopy. It felt alive, almost watching. We had dared each other to take the unbeaten path, the one that wasn't marked on any official map. To 13-year-olds, it seemed like the ultimate adventure. It started with laughter, snacks, and the occasional rustle of leaves that made us jump and giggle nervously. But then the trees began to change. The once welcoming greens grew darker, the trunks more gnarled. "Didn't we pass this before?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I dismissed it, but deep down unease crept in. It wasn't just the trees. The air turned colder. A strange silence fell, as if even the birds didn't dare make a sound. And then there were the markings, small, crude symbols etched into the bark. Trail markers? Sarah guessed, but they didn't feel like guidance. They felt like warnings. That's when we heard it. Faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind. It wasn't any language we knew, just soft, insistent murmurs. Jake, always the bravest of us, laughed it off. "Come on, it's probably the wind," he said, though his hands were trembling. When night fell, the forest didn't just grow dark, it became impenetrable, the shadows thick and moving. Our flashlight beams barely pierced the gloom. And then, as we set up a makeshift camp, something snapped a branch just beyond the circle of light. None of us slept that night. The next morning we packed up quickly, our nerves still raw. None of us mentioned the noises from the night before, the footsteps, the faint whispers, but we all felt it. Something was wrong. We decided to backtrack following the map, but the paths didn't make sense anymore. Trails we were sure we had walked before looked unfamiliar. "The sun rises east, right?" Michael muttered, staring at his compass. The needle spun aimlessly. We pushed forward anyway, trying to shake the unease. That's when Sarah noticed the first symbol carved into a tree. It looked like an eye, roughly etched, staring back at us. We had passed dozens of carvings before, but now it felt deliberate, watching. "Let's just keep moving," Jake said, but his voice wavered. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in. The trees loomed taller, and the paths twisted in impossible ways. Every step felt heavier, like the earth itself resisted us. And then we found it, a clearing. At its center stood a cabin, old, sagging, and covered in moss. "This wasn't here yesterday," Sarah whispered. I stepped closer, drawn to it. The door hung slightly ajar, and carved into its surface was the same eye symbol, but larger, more intricate. Jake reached out to push it open, but Michael grabbed his arm. "Don't," but it was too late. The door creaked, revealing a single room. Dust floated in the air, but the space looked recently disturbed, scattered footprints, and an overturned chair. On the far wall hung a map, old and yellowed, but it wasn't the map we had brought. This one showed the forest, and our trail marked in red ink. It ended right where we were standing. "Who made this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the door slammed shut behind us. A chill swept through the room. The whispers returned, louder now, circling us. I spun around, searching for the source, and my flashlight caught something outside the window, something pale, humanoid, but wrong. It stared at us, unmoving, and then it was gone. The cabin walls creaked as if they were breathing, inhaling and exhaling in time with our panicked hearts. The whispers outside grew louder, closer. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. But when Jake tried the door, it wouldn't budge. "It's jammed," he hissed, yanking the handle until his knuckles turned white. Michael slammed his shoulder into it. The wood groaned but held. That's when Sarah screamed. We turned to see her backing away from the window, her flashlight shaking in her hands. "It's out there," she cried. I moved closer and saw it too, a pale figure, half hidden by the trees. Its limbs were too long, its skin stretched thin and gray. It didn't move like a person. It twitched and shifted, almost vibrating, as if it didn't fully belong in our world, and then it stepped forward. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her back just as the glass shattered. A gust of freezing air swept through the cabin, and the whispers became a chorus. We scrambled for another exit. Jake kicked at the back wall, and the rotted wood splintered enough for us to squeeze through. We burst into the clearing and ran until our legs burned and our lungs screamed for air. But the forest didn't let us go. The paths twisted and folded in on themselves. We circled the same clearing twice before realizing the cabin was gone. In its place stood another carving, this time of 4 figures scratched deep into the bark. 4 figures. Us. No, Michael muttered. He dropped the compass, which spun uselessly on the ground. The whispers returned louder than ever, but this time they weren't outside. They were behind us. I turned, and my flashlight flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally, pulling away from the trees. And then I saw the footprints, wet and muddy, leading up to where we stood. They weren't ours. Sarah screamed again, but it was cut off by a sharp crack. When I turned, she was gone. Just gone. And in the sudden silence, the whispers spoke my name. Sarah. I screamed into the darkness, but my voice barely carried. The forest swallowed it whole. Michael grabbed my arm. We have to keep moving. His eyes were wild, his breath ragged. Jake was already ahead, flashlight beam darting through the trees. This way, he called. But as I turned to follow, I saw it again. The figure. It stood just beyond the reach of the light, still and wrong. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, and even though I couldn't make out its face, I knew it was looking at me. And then it moved. Not walking, jerking, lunging, like a puppet with its strings half cut. My legs froze. Michael shoved me, snapping me out of it. Run! We tore through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, but the whispers chased us. Closer, louder. Jake stumbled, his flashlight tumbling into the undergrowth. I turned back, but Michael didn't stop. Leave him. I hesitated for a heartbeat too long. The thing lunged from the shadows, and Jake's scream pierced the night. Then silence. Michael and I didn't stop running until we hit the edge of the clearing. But it wasn't a clearing. It was the same place. The carvings on the tree had changed. The 4 figures were now 3. Michael started to sob, and that's when I saw it, the same footprints we'd followed before, circling the clearing, but now there were more of them. Too many. The whispers didn't stop this time. They pressed in from all sides. I turned, and the figure was there. Close enough to see its eyes, they weren't empty. They were mine. I don't remember how I got out. When the rangers found me, I was barefoot, scratched, and muttering nonsense. They asked about the others, Michael, Jake, Sarah, but I couldn't answer. I just kept staring at the forest, waiting for it to move. The carvings were gone when they checked. No symbols, no footprints, no cabin, just endless trees. But I know it's still there, watching, waiting. I hear it sometimes in dreams, the whispers, the footsteps circling closer. And when I wake up, there's dirt under my nails. I'm not sure I ever really left. We thought it was just the wind. When the door slammed shut that first night, rattling in its frame, we laughed it off. Old cabins make noise, Matt said, his grin cocky as always. None of us wanted to admit how wrong it felt, the way the walls seemed too thin, the way the air seemed too still. It was supposed to be a training week before the campers arrived, a chance for us, the counselors, to bond and prepare. We spent the first day setting up supplies, joking about horror movies, and daring each other to check the dark corners of the attic. But that night, the jokes stopped. The wind picked up, howling around the cabin, but inside it felt worse, like the pressure was building, pushing against the walls. The lights flickered, and we blamed the old wiring. Then came the footsteps. At first, we thought it was animals outside, but they circled the cabin over and over until the sound came from above, from the roof. Emily swore she heard whispering, but Matt waved it off. Probably the trees, he said, but even he wasn't laughing anymore. We locked the doors, checked the windows twice, tried to sleep. And then, around midnight, the door creaked open slow, deliberate. No one was there, but there were footprints in the dirt, wet, leading inside. I tried to convince myself it was just one of us playing a prank, but deep down I knew better, because when I closed my eyes, I heard it again, the soft, breathy whisper coming from under my bed. The footprints didn't make sense. They were too small, too light, like a child's. But there were no kids here. Not yet. We searched the cabin, one room at a time. Matt had his flashlight, and Emily carried the fire poker. "There's nothing here," she said, but her voice cracked. That's when we heard it, the sound of something scraping against wood. Slow, rhythmic. It came from the attic. "Don't," Emily whispered, but Matt was already climbing the ladder. The hatch creaked open, and his flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness. "What do you see?" I called up. "Nothing." But his voice sounded wrong, flat, hollow. We waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, then thud. Something heavy hit the floor above us. "Matt?" No answer. I started up the ladder, but Emily grabbed my arm. "Listen." The whispers were back. They were faint at first, almost like a breeze. But as I strained to hear, they grew clearer, words I didn't understand, spoken in a voice that didn't sound human. I pulled away from Emily and climbed the ladder. The attic smelled of dust and mildew, and the light barely cut through the gloom. Matt stood in the corner, his back to me. "Matt?" He didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Matt, what are you?" He turned. His eyes were wide and unfocused. His lips moved, but the words were wrong, garbled, and broken. And in his hand he held something sharp and rusted. I stumbled back, nearly falling through the hatch. Emily screamed below. "Run!" I shouted. We didn't stop. We ran out into the night, into the freezing air, but the whispers followed. When we looked back, Matt was standing in the doorway, and he wasn't alone. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the trees. The moonlight cut through the fog, and for a second I thought we were safe. Then Emily grabbed my arm. Look. The cabin was gone. It wasn't just the door or the windows that had vanished. It was the entire structure. All that remained was an empty clearing surrounded by shadows. "No," I whispered. It was right there, but Emily wasn't looking at the clearing anymore. She was staring at the trees, at the shapes moving between them. "They're coming," she said. The figures emerged slowly, stepping out of the mist. They were human, or had been once. Their skin hung loose, pale and stretched, their eyes dark and empty, and leading them was Matt. I froze. It wasn't him, not anymore. His face was slack, his skin too pale. but it was the eyes that terrified me most. They weren't blank. They were focused on me. Emily tugged my sleeve. "We have to move." But there was nowhere to go. The trees pressed in around us, the fog swallowing everything. I tried to call out, to scream, but the sound died in my throat. And then Matt spoke. The voice wasn't his. It was layered low and guttural, but with something else beneath it. "Stay," it said. "Stay with us." Emily bolted. I followed, crashing through the underbrush, but the whispers were everywhere now. They moved with us, echoing between the trees. I didn't see her fall. I only heard the scream. When I turned, she was gone. I stood frozen, heart pounding, and then I saw the footprints, small and wet, circling around me. The whispers grew louder. The shadows moved closer. And then a hand grabbed my shoulder. The hand pulled me back hard. I spun, ready to fight, but it was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "Run," she whispered. "It's not Matt." I didn't need convincing. We tore through the trees, branches clawing at our arms, the whispers chasing us. But no matter how far we ran, they stayed with us, pressing in, circling like wolves. And then we saw it. The cabin. It was back, standing just as we had left it, except the door was wide open now, and the light inside flickered faintly. "No," Emily said, stepping back. "We can't go in there." But the figures were closing in, their pale faces emerging from the fog. "We don't have a choice," I said, grabbing her hand. We ran inside and slammed the door. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence, heavy, suffocating, and then the light went out. The darkness was absolute. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I felt its cold breath against my neck. I spun, shining the beam. Nothing. And then Matt's voice, quiet, broken. "Why did you leave me?" Emily screamed, and the light flickered. I saw him then standing in the corner, his face wrong, his eyes black and endless. "It's not him," I shouted, but it was too late. Emily stepped toward him. "Don't." I grabbed her, but the whispers exploded around us. The walls shuddered, the floor creaked, and the last thing I saw before the light died was Matt's hand reaching for her. And then the darkness swallowed us whole. I woke up in the clearing. Emily was gone. The cabin was gone. The rangers found me hours later, wandering barefoot, covered in dirt and scratches. They asked questions, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain the footprints or the whispers that still echoed in my head. Matt and Emily were never found. The search was called off after a week, but sometimes late at night I hear it, the knocking. Soft, steady, like footsteps circling outside my window. And when I close my eyes, I see the cabin again, waiting. And I know it's not finished with me. They said she drowned. That's what the camp counselors told us when we asked about the girl in the old black and white photo hanging in the mess hall. She smiled like someone who didn't know what was coming, her hair braided neatly over her shoulders. Her name was Lily, and 40 years ago, she slipped off the dock into the lake. They never found her body. We should have left it alone. It started as a joke, late-night ghost stories around the campfire. "Lily's still out there," one of the counselors whispered. "She waits by the water for someone to join her." We laughed. We always laughed until that night. It was past curfew when we snuck down to the lake. The water was still, smooth as glass, reflecting the moonlight. It felt wrong too quiet, but Jake dared us to go. 10 seconds in the water, he said, already pulling off his shoes. No one wanted to be called a coward, so we followed. The water was ice cold, biting against my skin as I waded in. We counted together 1, 2, 3 until we heard it. A splash. We froze, staring at the ripples spreading out from the center of the lake. Then came the sound, a faint, wet gasp, like someone struggling to breathe, and something broke the surface. It was pale, too pale, and as it drifted closer, I saw her face half hidden by weeds, eyes wide and staring. I ran. We all did. But when we reached the shore, one of us was missing. And out on the lake, the ripples were still moving. We searched for Jake until sunrise. The counselors thought it was a prank, said he probably wandered back to his cabin. But his bed was empty. His shoes were still by the dock. He'll turn up, they told us, but their voices didn't match their words. By the second night, the whispers started. I heard them first soft, like water lapping at the shore. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard my name, faint, wet. I shot up in bed and looked toward the lake. The fog was thicker that night, but I could see the water, black and still. And then there was movement, a ripple cutting across the surface, slow and deliberate. I shook Sarah awake. "Do you see that?" She did. We crept outside, following the whispers to the dock. The boards creaked under our feet, and the cold bit at my skin, but I couldn't stop. There was something floating just beneath the surface. "Jake?" Sarah whispered. I leaned closer. My reflection rippled, but it wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was pale, bloated, and wrong. Its eyes snapped open. I stumbled back, but the dock was slick, and I fell. The water closed over my head, freezing and heavy. I saw her then, Lily, drifting just below me. Her hair floated like weeds, her mouth open in a silent scream. She reached for me. I kicked, scrambling for the surface. Sarah grabbed my arm and yanked me out. We ran, soaked and shivering, but the whispers followed. By morning, we found footprints, wet and leading away from the dock, only they weren't ours. The footprints led straight to our cabin. They stopped just outside the door, and for a moment we thought it was over, just a cruel trick of the lake. But that night, the whispers came back. They weren't faint anymore. I woke to the sound of wet footsteps, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Sarah was already sitting up, clutching her blanket. "It's inside," she whispered. I didn't want to believe her, but then we saw it. The shadow moved across the floor, pausing at the foot of Sarah's bed. Neither of us dared to breathe. Then the door creaked open. I grabbed Sarah's arm, and we ran. Barefoot and half-dressed, we bolted for the counselor's cabin, pounding on the door until it opened. They didn't believe us. "It's your nerves," they said. "You're just upset about Jake." But we knew. The next morning, Sarah wouldn't talk. She just sat by the lake, staring at the water. Her eyes were sunken, rings with dark circles. She wouldn't sleep. Neither would I. I'd check the dock every hour, half expecting to see Jake standing there. But all I saw were ripples, like something was circling just below the surface. That night, Sarah disappeared. Her bed was empty. The door was open. And out on the dock, I saw her standing at the edge, staring into the water. I screamed her name, but she didn't turn. And then she stepped off. I ran, crashing through the fog, but when I reached the edge of the dock, she was gone. Only the ripples remained. and when I looked down, I saw them again, two pale hands reaching up from the depths. I turned and ran, but I knew the lake wasn't finished. Not yet. I didn't stop running until I reached the counselor's cabin. They tried to calm me down, but I couldn't stop shaking. "She's gone," I yelled. "Sarah's gone." They went to the lake with flashlights and radios. I waited by the shore, staring into the water. It was calm, too calm. And then I saw her, Sarah. She stood knee-deep in the lake, her hair hanging wet and heavy over her shoulders. Her head tilted slightly, and her eyes weren't hers anymore. "Sarah," I screamed, stepping closer. "Come back." But she didn't move. Instead, the water rippled around her, and something else began to rise another shape, pale and hollow-eyed. Lily. I froze as the girl from the legend stepped closer, her lips moving silently. The whispers filled the air again, louder this time, pulling at me like the current. Sarah stretched out her hand, and I saw the marks on her wrist, deep, red, and raw, like something had grabbed her and wouldn't let go. I couldn't let her go. I ran into the water, grabbing her arm, but her skin was cold, too cold. She didn't fight me, but as I pulled, Lily rose higher, her mouth opening in a soundless scream. The lake began to churn, and I felt something wrap around my ankle, pulling me down. "Don't let go," Sarah cried, her voice breaking through the whispers. I kicked hard, breaking free, and dragged her back to shore. But when I looked back, Lily was gone, and the lake went still again. Sarah never spoke about that night. We left camp the next morning. The counselors said it was for safety reasons, but they wouldn't look us in the eyes. Jake's body was never found. Neither was Lily's. Sarah stopped answering my calls after a few weeks. Her parents said she needed time. I understood. I needed time too. But some nights I dream of the lake still and dark, waiting. And when I wake up, my feet are damp, and the whispers echo in my ears. I haven't been near water since, and I never will.